We can also ask a function to return values back to us. And if that's the case, we have to indicate that we want the values to be returned by indicating the data type that will be returned. So let's go ahead and create a method that is exactly the same as the previous one. We're going to concatenate two strings. But this case, we're going to return a value, so we have to indicate a return type. In this case, it will be string. And this method of concatenate will actually end up being a little more true to what we should be dealing with in terms of discrete functionality, because we're only going to have, essentially, there'll be two lines of code in here, but it's only going to do one thing. So static string concatenate, again, it accepts the two arguments, first and last. And right off the bat, Visual Studio is complaining with their little red squiggly because it's saying, hey, not all code paths return a value. That's fine. We'll fix that here in just a moment. So we'll use the same values that we used above. String whole equals first plus last. And that will do the concatenation for us. Now in this function, because it is actually designed to return something, we have to use that return keyword, and we will return whole. So that's the value that we're going to return. So we're going to take whole, we're going to assign to it the concatenated value of first and last, and then we return that back to the calling application or the calling piece of code. Currently, there isn't anything calling it, right? So concat has been commented out, so it's not returning anything, it's not expecting anything to come back. What we now have to do is we have to set up a variable to accept the return value coming back, and we can do this a couple of ways. We know we're accepting a string value, so we can say string, let's just call it word, so we can keep the values a little bit separate so we know that we're passing information back and forth here in different variables. We'll call it string word and just leave it at that for now. And then we can say word equals concatenate. So C# knows about concatenate, and we will pass in first space, and then we want to pass in last, comma. And C# says, yeah, this is fine. You've declared a variable called word, and you're going to assign to that variable the result of this concatenate function, whatever concatenate does. We want you to do that. So if we execute it, nothing's going to happen. The assignment will take place, but we won't know that it did. So let's put in a console.writeLine, and then we will say word so that we can actually see that output on the screen. Control F5 to execute this. Our concatenation took place. Yay, it worked fine. I mentioned that there's a couple of different ways of actually calling a method that returns something to it. And the ways that we can do that is we've declared a variable here, and then we assign it here. Well, anytime we do variable declaration, we can also do variable assignment at the same time. So if we backspace out of here, get rid of that assignment on a separate line, we can actually do the assignment on the same line. So we declare the variable, we do the assignment on the same line, and it simply will work the way as it did before. Control F5, first, last. Because what we're doing is we're basically telling C#, I want you to assign to word whatever the result of this is. So C# functions a little bit strangely sometimes in the way it does this. It will declare the variable first, and then it will do a right to left afterwards. So it will go out and call this function first. The function does its concatenation, then it comes back in and it assigns it perfectly fine in here. So before we end, one more thing that I do want to show you that you can also do with this anytime you want to call another function. C# allows you to basically build statements from multiple substatements. So what we can actually do here is we can, within our console.writeLine method, get the value back from the concatenate method as well. Much like we deal with mathematical parentheses for orders of operation, this kind of works the same way. Our internal values take place first, and then we go to the outer values. So if we do a Control F5, it works perfectly the same as the other one did. All right, so these are different ways of calling those methods or the functions that you create, however you want to accept that return value coming back. It's very important to know that if you are writing a function that is returning a value, you have to specify the data type that will be returned, okay? So that's functions in a nutshell. It's a very quick and short introduction to the functions. These are quick and simple functions. There's not a whole lot of information in them, but it does show you how you can create scope modifiers, static. In this case, because we're working with the static void main, You won't always use that. You'll use public or private in other locations. The return type, if it's going to return a value, or void if it is not returning a value. For those of you who are coming from Visual Basic and looking at C#, void would be the same as you writing something called a sub or a subroutine. And returning a value would be the same as you creating a function. All right, so these are called functions in C#. Visual Basic calls them a sub or a function. Again, you're either returning or not returning a value. You give your function a name. You put arguments in the parentheses if it's going to accept. Again, you don't have to put anything in here. Empty parentheses means it's not accepting anything, but in which case this method is going to complain because we don't have anything in here, right? So you can accept arguments. You don't have to accept arguments. There's no limit or virtually no limit on what you can put in here. Open and close your function with curly braces and then put your lines of code you want to execute in here. Remember, if you're returning a value, you must put the return statement in your function.